Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to those of you who are on the West Coast joining us, and some of you who are joining us from the Emerald Isle of Ireland, and I would say good evening to you.
Wow.
My name is Linwood Sloan. I am the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Monument Project, and it is such a great honor and privilege to bring this program to you, the second in our 2021 series called Live and Learn. Now, you've all heard your grandmother or your elders say, well, Lord, child, live and learn. And that's exactly what we're here to do today, is to each one teach one, and each one bring one back into the sun. This is our second program with our new partners and co-host, the Dauphin County Library System. And this series leads to the inauguration of their Thomas Morris Chester Welcome and Research Center, the newest part of the expansion of the public library. It sits at the foot of Front and Walnut Street on the opposite end of the monument that was dedicated on November 16th. And may I have the next slide, please? We were excited about the completion of a 3-year project, which was the dedication of a monument to the 15th and the 19th Amendment. It is placed at the gateway of the historic Old 8th Ward, a authenticated site of the Underground Railroad, and the gateway to the community that the capital of Pennsylvania is now on the site of. Here you see me pouring libation to the new monument. And on your right of your screen, you will see Thomas Morris Chester, Jacob T. Compton, William Howard Day, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Next slide, please. The monument was created for us by the brilliant Becky Alt. The 4 great orators stand around a historic, iconic orator's pedestal. On that pedestal is the name of 100 leaders, African-American leaders of that once valued, now vanished community. And the narrative of the monument is that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is handing William Howard Day back the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, which gave African-American men the right to vote in 1870. And Frances is saying, I see women in this document nowhere. And it would take 50 more years till 1920 for women to receive the right to vote. And in that period from 1870 to 1920 is the end of Reconstruction and that horrible period that we refer to as Jim Crow. If you read the newspaper tonight, you may think that we are in the Jim Crow period right now. You might think that the struggle for the value of the vote for men and women is still going on with the news about the struggle to pass the new civil rights bill, the anxiety around the suppression of voters, the critical issues around redlining. And so the struggle for African Americans and women to vote goes on. And today we are going to honor Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the woman who is handing the 15th Amendment back, and the women of that historic community, African American suffragists, abolitionists, temperance workers, and civil rights leaders. Next slide, please. We want to honor in this program, as we did in our January program, the tremendous contribution that the Prince Hall Masonic Lodge and the Eastern Stars have made to the civil rights, civil liberties, benevolence, civil construction, and advancement of African Americans. And we are very pleased to have the grand worthy matron of the Eastern Stars, Rowena R. Woodson, and the grand worthy patron, Juan L. Summers here. And I'd like to bring you welcome remarks from our two guests. Grand worthy matron, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'm very thankful that you asked me to be here during Women's Month. So this is not just a time for us to shine, but a time for all women to look at our history and how wonderful that we were a part of a lot of new things that are still going on today. But thank you for the invitation. I welcome it.
Madam, one of the most profound memories that I have of my grandmother is not her life, but the moment of her death when the Eastern Stars gave her her funeral. It transcended death. It transcended our tears. We were caught up in the magic, the mysticism, and the transformation into the powerful rituals of the Eastern Stars. And so you have touched my family. I come from a very long line of women who were Eastern Stars. And whenever I see that symbol, I am touched in body, mind, and spirit. The pictures below on the back wall here include my grandfather, a 33rd-degree Mason, and my great-grandfather, who was a grand worthy master in Pittsburgh. And I now bring you greetings and welcome to Juan L. Stewart, the grand worthy patron. Welcome, sir.
Sir, it's Grand Juan L. Summers. Thank you for having us on, having both my partner and I. We are elated to be here. We actually were kind of nervous of being here, and I talked to her this afternoon, this morning, and so we're elated to be here. We're so glad that you asked us to be on this program, and also, I just want to say that I first wanted to give honor to my God and to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, because He is the author and finisher of my faith. So I just wanted to say to those who are on the panel, we are elated to be here. My grand worthy matron, Sister Rowena R. Wooten. We try to do our best to keep our members somewhat engaged, and how we do that is, through meetings such as the one we have today, and also we do it over the telephone. So we are glad to be here, and I continue to say that this program is one for the ages.
Thank you very much, sir. We hope to set a banquet before the two of you today of the achievements of the men and women of the old 8th Ward who were in the Masonic Lodge, in the Eastern Stars, the House of Ruth, the Henry Highland Garnett Society, and the Temperance Society. Behold how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. My good friend, the Reverend Yvette Davis, may I have the next slide, please? We'll begin our journey in this time we have together with her interview of Miss Angela Dodson, who has charmed, elated, challenged, compelled, cajoled, and enlightened us to remember the ladies who brought us the solidarity around the vote. I turn the program over now to Reverend Yvette Davis.
Thank you so much, Linwood, our visionary and our leader. It is just a special honor to introduce Ms. Angela P. Dodson, the author of Remember the Ladies, celebrating those who fought for freedom at the ballot box. And this book tells about the women's suffrage movement in the United States and women's political gains up to the present. Ms. Dodson is an independent editor, writer, and consultant. In 2012, she founded the editorial services company, Editors on Call, to link freelancers to clients in need of writing, editing, graphic, and photographic services. Ms. Dodson is a former senior editor and former style editor for the New York Times. And she's most recently been an online editor and book reviewer for Diverse, Issues in Higher Education, diverseeducation.com, and diversebooks.net. She is also the former executive editor of Black Issues Book Review. Welcome to Harrisburg, Miss Angela P. Dodson. It is so great to have you with us this evening. And first, we would love to hear about your work and your journey with the women's suffrage movement and your adventure with Frances Harper.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here today. I'm sorry I can't get my video going for all of you. My work on this book began, I guess, about 5 years ago, or a little bit longer than that. Basically, at the request of the publisher. I have worked in publishing as a freelancer for about the last dozen years, and I've done several projects for this particular publisher, either as a ghostwriter, an editor, a book fixer. And my most recent project before this had been to help my husband with his book, Obama's Legacy, what he accomplished as president. My husband is Michael Days, recently retired as a vice president for the Philadelphia Media Network. So my editor asked me, or his editor asked me, whether there was a book that I wanted to work on, and I had proposed a few ideas that they promptly rejected. And then they said, you know, but we have these suffrage anniversaries coming up. A lot of the state anniversaries were coming up. New York's anniversary was 2017 for the centennial, and that was when this book was slated to come out. So I started researching enough to do a sort of mini book proposal for her. And I became so fascinated with all of the characters in this book. That's what I refer to them as, and their interrelationships and friendships and their fallings out and their coming back together along the way. And Frances Harper was one of the people that I really didn't know a whole lot about before I started researching the book. And she began to pop up just about everywhere. So, you know, naturally she became a major part of this story, and rightly so. She, you know, for her time, she did a lot of firsts. She was the first woman to have first Black woman to have a short story published. She was among the first to have a novel published. Things like that, as well as her work in the suffrage movement, and before that in the abolition movement, and also in the temperance movement. So,
Ashley, may we have the next slide, please, Ashley? Yes, ma'am.
okay, and I hope that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned that you were not familiar with Frances Harper until you embarked on this journey towards working on this book. What would you say was most fascinating about her that really kept you in the work towards researching her life and her role in the suffragist movement?
One, the way people described her as basically a very eloquent, well-spoken woman, and she was certainly a very interesting writer. She wrote, mostly she was known for her poetry. And a lot of her poetry had been lost over the years, I mean, literally destroyed by a publisher once when her publisher was sold. So a lot of it we're not familiar with, and it's not taught in schools. But, you know, she was a woman that white people admired and spoke extremely well of, as well as Black people. Because of the way she carried herself and the way she spoke. And she did not mince words, but she said what she had to say in very smooth, educated remarks, you know, just a well-spoken woman. In contrast, at the same time, to Sojourner Truth, who was equally outspoken, but she was a little rougher around the edges. Sojourner Truth was not an educated woman as Harper was. And people liked her, but she was very blunt in her speaking and sometimes hard to follow. Harper was not like that. So that's interesting in and of itself. So.
That is so neat. And you mentioned earlier that you even captured the messiness of the suffragist movement during the period covered by your book. And it also sounds as though you also captured Frances Harper's personality in the narrative. So that is really very powerful. So what was your research process? How did you prepare to write Remember the Ladies?
Well, one of the things when I first started, my husband, being a newspaper editor as well, said, well, you know, you're going to have to figure out what made each of these women tick. Who were they? What could possibly make women, in most cases, upper class, white women, elite American women, go against everything they'd ever been taught and learned, and basically buck the system that had been in place for not just hundreds of years, thousands of years of tradition. Women did not speak in public. Women did not speak outside the home. Women didn't really go outside the home, much less to be standing in public lecturing about women's suffrage and demanding the vote. So to do that, I had to understand each woman. I read, in some cases, 2, 3, 4 biographies of people, and Susan B. Anthony, and Lucy Stone, and Lucretia Mott, who's a great Philadelphian, as well as people like Sojourner Truth and Frances Harper, whatever I could find in terms of books on them. When I turned in my first draft, I told my editor that my office looked like a feminist library had blown up in here. And the operative word was blown up, because there were books laid open. There were books open and facing down. There were books underneath my desk, and there still are, because I keep having to like pull them out again and research an article or something, or try to remember where I found something. So, you know, I went through a lot of books, a lot of the 6-volume history of women's suffrage. I know probably now about as well as anybody, and it's not easy to read because it's not indexed, and it is online, but it's not in any particular order. You have to remember where you found something. I read, you know, original speeches as much as I could to get to original stuff. I read a lot of newspaper articles and stuff that had not been used in other people's books. So there was a lot to it. I had to do a lot of reading and do it fairly quickly, because the book was due, you know, on deadline for the publisher. It wasn't like I had years of scholarly research behind me and had been working on it for years before I found a publisher. It was just quite the opposite. Yes, we want it, and we want it, you know, in X amount of time. So that was different from most people's process. Unfortunately, I, you know, grew up as a newspaper reporter, so I can research quickly and write quickly, but it was a lot of material to go through, just, you know, incredible amounts of reading.
So if you had to think of one amazing discovery through all of your research, what comes to mind first?
I'm not sure it's an amazing discovery, but I found I found a way to look at the movement, I think, in ways that a lot of people don't. We as Black people particularly hear about a lot of the racism in the movement and how Black women were kept out. And we read much less about how they were part of the process from the very beginning. The first woman ever to address audiences on public topics was a Black woman, Maria Miller Stewart, before any white woman had begun lecturing in this country, because women weren't supposed to speak in public, as you recall, as I said. So there's that. And then they, you know, there probably were no Black women at the Seneca Falls Convention that most people date the women's movement from. But some of the Black historians argue that there very well could have been. We just don't know. We don't know who was there. Some abolitionists might have bought their maid for all we know, but we don't know. But we do know that as early as 1850, Black women start showing up at these meetings. Sojourner Truth was probably at the National Women's Convention as early as 1850, and may have been attending some smaller meetings before then. So, you know, I see it more as an interweaving of all of the activists who had, in some cases, started in the temperance movement. That's where Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met each other. And began working together. Then most of them worked together in the abolition movement, particularly in Philadelphia. And a lot of them worked in something called the free produce movement, which I've never been taught in school, that people actually went around boycotting anything that was made by enslaved labor. And they educated each other on what that might entail. And that would have taken a great deal of sacrifice. They could not use cotton, tobacco, sugar, molasses, maybe, whatever was grown in the South, whatever was made in the South, they didn't use. And they had stores, kind of like the Whole Foods or whatever, where they sold stuff to each other that had that they guaranteed wasn't made by a slave anywhere, an enslaved person. So there was that, and then you'd have, you know, we don't think of men as having been involved, but a lot of the leading men of the day would be involved in the women's meetings. Frederick Douglass went to all the women's meetings, but so did some of the leading abolitionists like Garrison and William Garrison. People like that. Lucretia May Alcott's father was at a lot of these meetings. And they not only were there, they were officers of the convention. They signed documents, they signed the sentiments for whatever particular convention. Sometimes they signed the call for the convention as what's customary. So there's a lot of interaction. There's one chapter where I describe where a lot of these people are together in New York because there's a Black man who's being denied seating at the temperance convention and a white woman who was denied seating as a delegate at the temperance convention. So they all went together, and then they held a separate temperance meeting, the all people's, all world temperance meeting, as kind of a counter meeting. And then they all go off to the abolition convention, the anti-slavery convention. Then they all go off to the women's convention in New York in the same week. And, you know, you see some of the same names keep popping up. So it's like, you know, it's like they're multi-purpose activists and extreme activists for their day in a way that we don't even teach the abolition movement. We know there were kind of some abolitionists who kind of wrote some letters, whatever, but the extremes that they went to the point of even funding John Brown in his revolt. Some of these people did send him money. Some of these people met with him. Harper met with him. Harper sent him letters. And sent him letters after he was caught and waiting to be executed. So there's a level of activism that is not taught in our schools, and we don't realize the relationships some of these people had, and across racial lines and across gender lines and everything else. So.
Thank you. We have a question from one of the participants. Did you find that a number of women were against the ratification of the amendment or movements against ratification?
Yes. There was a whole segment of anti-suffragists who organized, had their own conventions and organizations and publications, and spoke out on it up to the day it was ratified. There was an extreme amount of lobbying by anti-suffragists and suffragists in Tennessee when it came down to be the last state that was needed. So, you know, there's a whole thing about that that I was not aware of. So, you know, people often ask, well, who would have been against it? Well, for one thing, they were funded by people like industry and the liquor industry and the railroads or whatever. People feared that if women got the vote, they would vote against liquor, for instance. They would vote for better wages for women. So industry in general was against it. They would vote against child labor. So industry in general was against that. So there were a lot of reasons why people opposed, as well as traditional reasons that women feared. You know, we all lived through the ERA. It was the same arguments that they would lose this pedestal that they supposed themselves to be on, that the privileges of being a woman and being taken care of and not having to worry your pretty little head about things like voting and law and stuff. Was considered beyond women, and women would not have an appetite for it and wouldn't vote if they got the vote. So
Reverend Davis, Ms. Dodson.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Speaking about pedestal, if I may move to a different subject for just a moment. Frances Harper and the three gentlemen are standing around an iconic pedestal. And on that pedestal are the names of 100 people, we call them the voices of the old 8th Ward. There are 34 women's names on that pedestal. And I'd like to invite Dr. Jean Corey to share with Ms. Dodson some stories about some of the women that were on that pedestal. May I have the next slide, please? Dr. Jean Corey from Messiah University. Jean, would you highlight for Ms. Dodson? We'll come back to a conversation with her and Reverend Davis, but could you highlight for us the 34 women, some stories of those women, and especially our book called 100 Voices?
Yes, Ashley, can I share my screen now? Is that okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. It's saying that it won't let me share. Sorry.
Sorry, can you try again?
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So thanks so much. This is really great. I love having this conversation put in the broader context to think what was going on. Let me start this. So I just love this picture of Frances Harper, AKA Sharia Ben, with the monument. We actually, there was a session on the library hosted last night for Women's History Month also about Harper. And we were talking about this idea of Frances Harper's, which this was her speech at the Columbian exhibit in the late 1900s, late 1800s. And she's, I love this. She said, though through weary wasting years, men have destroyed, dashed in pieces and overthrown, but today we stand on the threshold of women's era, and women's work is grandly constructive. And I think that is exactly what really ties all of these women, these 34 women together, this idea that their work was grandly constructed. And actually Martha Jones, who has written a book, she's a historian from Johns Hopkins, but called All Bound Up Together. So she's using this quote from Frances Harper, but she talks about how the work of women was not limited to one single sphere. It's transcended all of these spheres. And the truth is that as a white woman, and seeing the world through my particular perspective, last year, my associate, Katie Wingert, who helped work on, she's actually one of the editors of the book, we were talking just recently about last year and all I said, we learned so much, didn't she? And she said, yes, and we had to unlearn so much, didn't we? And it was a year of learning and unlearning and learning and unlearning, because it really messed with my categories, because you can't just say they're writers, you can't say they're theologians. They transcended all these spheres, and the women's club movement was, it really expressed that. And Martha Jones talks about how it gave them the opportunity to have power in those spheres, but it wasn't limited to just those spheres. So that's what I wanted to start out with. So Ann Amos, this is a really interesting thing. We don't have any pictures of Ann Amos, but I would pay big bucks for someone if they could find one, really. Or actually, I'll say Linwood would pay big bucks if we could find one. But there's no, we haven't found any picture of her. There's no text that we can attribute to her, but we do know that she was called the Grand Scribe, actually. And we have lots of accounts of her reading papers, but we don't have those papers anywhere. I paid big bucks for that, but I'm kind of interested in the fact that I'm so desperate to have a physical image or a physical text when her work is embodied in all sorts of other ways, which I just love to think about. But I just want to, this is from her sense, this is the original cards we put out. And if you see, it says that her occupation was keeping house. Well, that was actually, her occupation was much more than that. And I don't know if she got paid to keep house. I don't know what they were talking about here. But she did actually keep house, because she and her husband, they were a stop on the Underground Railroad. She did house people. She started a kindergarten at Wesley Union AME Zion. And she did keep house in all sorts of ways, but she was a lot more than just a housekeeper. And one thing we do know about her that's probably the most treasured text that we have about Ann Amos is this obituary, this beautiful, beautiful obituary written by John Scott. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can go to digitalharrisburg.com and see the whole obituary. But he closes it with, she was the suffragist in her church, and the woman of the Zion church owe a debt of gratitude to her. Should not her memory be held sacred? Through the blazing sun or drifting snows, through the rains or heated drought, when the men were lax or mourners wept, she was always at her church, and of her widow's mite she always gave to God's cause to foster and advance. And I isn't that beautiful obituary? What more could you have someone say about you? But that was in the Pittsburgh Courier. This is a really interesting thing. She and Annie Amos and Frances Harper were born the same year and died the same year. She was born in 1825 and she died in 1911. And we have accounts of Frances Harper being in Harrisburg, but we don't know if they, I just can't imagine that they weren't in the same rooms. You know, we do have to use creative license here. Because she was at Wesley Union AME Zion and Frances Harper spoke at Wesley Union AME Zion, I assume that yes, they did rub shoulders and they did co-conspire about making a better world. But another really kind of fun thing, there's one mention of Harrisburg in Frederick Douglass's papers. That this is from David Blythe's biography of Frederick Douglass, and he only found one mention of Harrisburg. I mean, we know that he wrote about Harrisburg, Frederick Douglass, but he talks about the women and how gracious the women were at Wesley Union AME Zion Church. So that would have been Annie Amos too. So there you go. So Anne Amos, she was, pardon?
Keep going.
Oh, Anne Amos was orator, grand scribe, suffragist, organizer. She was associated with many clubs, including the Garnett League. But Linwood, I just have to point this out to you. Actually, that the monument is the second monument in the city dedicated to African Americans, because here is this monument that the women, a lot of the women on the Old Eighth Ward are responsible for raising funds. They did a lot of work to raise these funds, and this is in Lincoln Cemetery, and it's a tribute to the men of the Civil War. So it's in bad shape right now, which makes me so sad. But Anne Amos was at the front of raising funds and building that monument in Lincoln Cemetery. And here's her church, and this is where a lot of the happenings went on. Another interesting thing, I remember reading what a historian who wrote about Alice Dunbar Nelson and her work as suffragist and how it happened in the churches. And she attributes it to happening in the churches, and that was true. Wesley Union was a site. We do know from the records that a lot happened in Wesley Union AME Zion Church in advocating for the women's vote. But Martha Jones explains it not as just a geographic thing. It's just that these spheres were much blurrier than we think of them today. So it was geographic, but it also was spiritual. So as Warnock said yesterday, you know, our vote is our prayer. And I think that distinction, they didn't have those same distinctions that we have today, or that I, as a white woman, think about these different distinct spheres. So I'm going to move on, but please.
Jean, just before you move on, two quick notes I'd like to place. The monument, which we placed at 4th and Walnut Street at the front of Tanner's Alley, stands on the site of a PHMC, Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission, blue and gold sign. Those of you who are Pennsylvanians are familiar with that historic marker. And that marker says that on that site, Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison spoke at the Wesley AME Zion Church to a gathering at the crossroads of the Old Eighth Ward on the to speak in favor of the suffragette, which is why the monument is called a gathering at the crossroads, and is why it's placed on that site. And then the other thing, really briefly, Jean, is keeping house. We know that when the Negro Convention was held in Harrisburg, its 584 delegates were not allowed to stay in white hotels and boarding houses. And so the women of the 8th Ward housed them. The first Airbnbs, I would like to think, that these African-American women put up during most of the African-American conventions in Harrisburg and in central Pennsylvania. Those women housed the delegates to those conventions. And so keeping house and keeping women anchored in center means much more to us today than just mopping floors and washing dishes.
Well, I was thinking, you know, her housekeeping, making a home wasn't located in a particular building. It extended to the city and the community. She was about creating a better world where more people would be at home. That was her end. And we just know this by constructing these different articles and seeing where her name. So her text is much larger than just the print text that we can't find or the images we can't find. It lives around us. And then there's Hannah.
For our guests, this process is called assumptive dialogue. Historians, humanists, educators, through the collection of artifacts, we lay them out like a jigsaw puzzle and an anagram, and we can begin to assume if Frances Harper was speaking at Wesley and Annie Amos was such an organizer there, that Annie may have been in the audience of Frances's presentation. Thanks, Jean. We'll go to.
Oh, and I want to be aware of my time. Hannah Braxton Jones is, and of course she's a little later than Annie Amos, but she lived on Tanner Street, very close to Wesley Union AE, and she owned her own home. And so we do know that when the old Eighth Ward was raised, that she was one of the homeowners, and so she, an African-American woman homeowner, a woman homeowner at all, was rare. So that was pretty exciting to find out. I just wanted, this is so serendipitous. I don't like to say that really. I think it was orchestrated, but the fact that we have this picture of Hannah Braxton Jones is just really kind of amazing. We had poetry workshops. The Center for Public Community has had poetry in place workshops for about maybe 7 years now. But Marian Dornell, the woman on the right here, she is very instrumental in us getting poetry in place started, and she has been our guest poet. She's now passed, but she was our guest poet for many in our beginning years. But we were doing these poetry workshops around the old Eighth Ward, and they just drew the names of people. It was random. They just drew the names. And this young man, Wesley, drew the name of Hannah Braxton Jones. Our guest poet that day was Marian Anderson, and her jaw dropped to the ground because Hannah Braxton Jones was her great-great-grandmother, her great-grandmother. And so when he called out her name, she just, she couldn't believe it. So anyway, he really worked on a poem. He revised it, and this is him. She came to hear him deliver the poem to another poet, Marilyn Nelson, and so that was really fun. That night of these poets gathering together, and he was so proud. But Marian Dornell brought a picture and then a signed copy of her own book, because Marian Dornell was a poet as well, Unicorn Captivity. And if you haven't read Marian Dornell's book, Unicorn in Captivity, you really should get it. You can look on Amazon and find it, but it's so powerful. And she details the history of Harrisburg through poetry and through her own perspective as an African-American woman growing up in segregated Central PA. But this is the other thing that kind of I was very intrigued with, is several of these women, not just Hannah Braxton Jones, were at the table when these African-American churches were founded. And so her mother died, Hannah Braxton Jones' mother died when she was 16. But as a 17-year-old, she was one of the 6 people that were at the table that founded, this is in the Second Baptist Church archives, that founded Second Baptist Church. That's her father right there, Joseph Braxton. And then that's a really fabulous picture of Second Baptist Church, which is not at the same location. It was at a different location then, but it's the original members of Second Baptist Church. And I'm not going to stop. This is a fun little poem that, so the fun thing, I mean, there are lots of Hannah Braxton Jones's descendants are still, I mean, around, and they're so proud. And this, I mean, this is happens, you know, with all these women. Their descendants are doing amazing things. We'll get to hear about from Yvonne Hollis pretty soon, but they're still doing that work. They're still carrying on the work of their ancestors. But this is one of her descendants wrote a complimentary poem that went next to Wesley's that gave a little more factual account of Hannah Braxton Jones, because, you know, Wesley didn't have a lot of information. He was using his imagination. So she was a musician, churchwoman, music teacher, domestic, mother, grandmother. I use the word other mother. That's a term that Patricia Hill Collins talks about. And she talks about African-American women's understanding of mothering, not being limited to biological, not being limited to even the tribe, but it transcends all of those things to nurturing the seventh generation, that they're nurturing the generation to come. And I think that is very true of Hannah Braxton Jones. And I know it's very true of Marion Dornell. And it makes me excited to think about our future with those, because of their other mothering. Their mother work is a term that Patricia Hill Collins uses. Esther Poe Opal is the one we know most about. She lived most recently, and her archives are actually at Dickinson College. But she moved from the old Eighth Ward to Baum Street, and she lived, a lot of folks moved to Baum Street, and she lived on the same block as Gwendolyn Bennett. She graduated from Central High School, and she was the first African-American graduate of Dickinson College, but she was not allowed to board there. She had to come home every night because they wouldn't allow her as an African-American woman to board there. This picture is, again, oh dear. But this picture is, again, I got ahead of myself and now I can't find, oh, here we go. This picture is, again, sort of serendipitous. It's not really, but one of the descendants of George Imes found this in her house, Anne Braxton. Her father lived next door to Ester Popel, and her father had kept this picture of her all these years. And so we were thrilled to get this picture from Anne Braxton of Esther Popel, the graduate. So thanks to Anne and Mary Braxton for their many resources. And just fun, again, I'm not gonna, you all can go look at this yourself, but her diary, 1919 diary it's online, it's at Dickinson, and it really is pretty fun to hear her. You can hear her personality. She has such personality. She's very sassy. You know, she's a teenager at this point, but she has a little section about meeting Booker T. Washington. Actually, the Braxton sisters, I sent the document to them and they searched through it and they found all sorts of neighbors. They knew all the people in the journals, which was so fun. So if you're from this area, you might want to check that out on Dickinson's website. The last thing that I do want to mention is Esther Popel's writing, and I think this is true with African-American writers at the beginning of the 20th century. Their poetry wrote about beautiful things that addressed beauty, like most poetry did, but they also addressed the ugly truths of our nation. And so it's kind of interesting to have these texts right next to each other, but Esther Popel has a couple really strong poems about lynching, and thank goodness. I mean, they were Black Lives Matter. They were addressing these things through their text, through poetry, through prose, you know, as was Frances Harper and Alice Dunbar Nelson. They used their text, their pen, to address the horrors of lynching that we still have with us today. I mean, what an amazing thing last night to be talking about Frances Harper and her concerns about lynching just after that Atlanta shooting, that we're still all this time now, you know, 100 years later, still addressing these same issues. And their pen was very powerful. So if you get a chance, you can go look at Esther Popel's writing. You can find a lot of this stuff on our website. at digitalharrisburg.com, because we have their archives, their materials are put in folders so people can go look at individuals and find this. In addition to that, we just released today an exhibit for Women's History Month about the women's organizations of the Old Eighth Ward. So you can go and look at the exhibit and look at the different organizations that they were involved in. And we've really had fun, thanks to Avi Weiser, who really put a lot of time into that, and that just went live today. But this is picture just Marion Dornell, like many.
You just froze, Jean. I am afraid Jean just froze. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, good friends, we're going to wait for technology to work itself out, but we'll move forward. If I could, Ashley, if you could go back to my PowerPoint for a moment, please.
Yes, just one minute.
We'll talk about some of those organizations that women had in the old Eighth Ward and invite Caleb Jackson, a living legacy and encyclopedia, and Mr. Felix Garnett, who is the grand historian of the Prince Hall Masons, to reflect on some of those women organizations, particularly the Order of the Eastern Stars and the House of Ruth. It says Daughters of Ruth, but it should be the House of Ruth. Welcome, Caleb. Welcome, Felix. Felix, would you start by talking about the Order of the Eastern Stars in Pennsylvania and in Harrisburg in the old Eighth Ward?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And I wanted to start off and let you know that in the old Eighth Ward, our first OES chapter was formed in that ward, and they were associated with our lodge, Chosen Friends Lodge 43. As you know, in
Ashley, would you go to the next slide for me, please? Thank you.
Okay, and as of in 1899, at the turn of the century, we had a Grand Master who was a member of Chosen Friends 43, and he was approached by Elizabeth Snyder. And her husband, John, was also in Chosen Friends 43. And from that, she asked permission to start an Eastern Star chapter in Pennsylvania. There were roughly about 25 chapters already throughout the United States that were associated with Prince Hall Masons. And so that was the start of the OES in Pennsylvania. Of course, John L. Thomas, he gave permission to do that in 1900, in May of 1900. The Esther Chapter #1, which was associated with the Chosen Friends 43 members, that was started in Pennsylvania. Along with that, we had a lot of members who were to become grand matrons by 1909, but Chosen Friends really was the lodge of Prince Hall Masons that actually started what we have today as Deborah Grand Chapter, Order of Eastern Stars. And our Grand Matron is on now. And with her permission, she allowed me to do that. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the names of Brenda Wilkinson Monroe, who is the Grand Historian of Deborah Grand Chapter, Order of Eastern Star, and Judith Abel Henry, who's the Grand Historian Emeritus. So I'm actually giving this history instead of, you know, them being here today. Also, one of the chartered members of that Esther chapter, #1, was Hattie Sinclair Grant, and she's one of the 34 women that are in the 100 Voices book. And Hattie was also, her actual name was Harriet, real name, and her family was the Sinclair family. And she was a teacher, but she was one of the chartered members of Esther chapter #1, even though she wasn't the first matron of the chapter. But her husband was actually a Grand Lodge officer at the turn of the century. He went on to become the Grand Master in 1908, 1909. And he was James W. Grant. And he also, a member of Chosen Friends 43, he is actually in the 100 Voices book also. So again, Chosen Friends 43 really very instrumental in creating the Order of Eastern Star. She became Grand Worthy Matron when her husband was the Grand Master of Prince Hall Masons. She became the Grand Worthy Matron after we had successfully had 5 chapters formed from the turn of the century to 1909. And in November 1909, we formed the Pennsylvania Grand Chapter. And she became the first Grand Worthy Matron at that time. And she also served for about 6 years, and our Grand Chapter, the Pennsylvania Grand Chapter, reorganized in 1915 under the support of Ozil Chapter in New Jersey, Ozil Grand Chapter in New Jersey. And then that's when we became Deborah Grand Chapter and actually added 5 more chapters to the fold. The other thing that was previously mentioned by Jean Corey was John Paul Scott. And so she mentioned several people. She talked about Hannah Braxton Jones. Well, Hannah Braxton Jones' granddaughter was actually Hannah Scott Cannon, who was John Paul Scott's daughter. So a lot of things that happened at Wesley AME Zion Church, it was more or less what we call a family affair. Everyone knew each other. They were in organizations together and so forth. She also talked about Ester Popel, and her mother was also a member. Helen K. Popel was a member of Esther chapter #1 in the Old 8th Ward. All their accomplishments as teachers, suffragists, church stewards, church leaders, all those things happened in the organization of the Eastern Stars. This was one of the organizations under the banner of Masons that served the community. And all these women, they're actually in the book, The 100 Voices. They all are associated mostly with Paxton Lodge number 16 in Steelton. And of course, the main ones in Harrisburg was Chosen Friends Lodge 43.
Felix, this is such an amazing photograph. We never had all the women's names are on the monument and their histories are in the book, but we never had a photograph of Harriet St. Clair Grant. Where did this photograph come from? When you sent it to me in my email, I literally jumped for joy.
This was a photograph we actually have at our Grand Lodge in Philadelphia, and it's in our, what we call our OES room, or Order Eastern Star room, on our second floor level. And this is the photograph that we had. And I just really took a snapshot of that photograph. I've always kept it in my historical file.
Well, maybe we can find, could you go to the next slide, please, Ashley? Maybe we can find some of our other women in your room, and we'll have to connect our history detectives and with you, because you might have a treasure chest of visual images of these ladies that we.
Yeah, well, I think we've shared that over, the course of, our relationship. You had pictures or newspaper clippings, and then I had actually proceedings and certain things that showed that these people are members or were members. We have a lot of chapter histories. Of course, we have lodge histories. That's how we were able to connect the dots with the Masons of the Old Eighth Ward. And so we were able to say, yes, they were in our, 1910 proceedings, and they were a member at the time and so forth. So again, we actually, from Chosen Friends, we actually have 6 Grand Masters from that from that particular lodge. And 5 of those Grand Masters are actually in the 100 Voices book, and certainly 3 of them were very influential. Well, I'll actually say 4 of them were actually very influential in getting the Order of Eastern Star either started or recognized to what it is today. And that's John L. Thomas, James W. Grant, and then John Paul Scott, who made sure that they were set apart properly and reorganized. And in 1916, they became Deborah Grant Chapter. So, and
we know that there's the John Scott School that is named after him. May I have the next slide, please, Ashley? The other grand organization in the Old Eighth Ward was the House of Ruth, and I'd like Caleb Jackson, our master historian of our history detectives. Caleb, would you share some stories about the House of Ruth?
Yes, I would like to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. From my information, the Miriam chapter of the Household of Ruth was founded September the 2nd, 1857 in Harrisburg by Joseph C. Bustle, who is a well-known name. I have 2 references to this that gave the same date. And according to, one of them was the New York Broadax newspaper, and they mentioned that the charter members, actually they didn't give the women's first name, they told it Mrs. John Price, Mrs. John Gator, Mrs. William Robinson, Mrs. J.C. Bustle, and Mrs. Jerry Henson. So supposedly these were the charter members in 1857. So I was surprised to find that they were chosen, that Harrisburg had the pleasure of being one of the first chapters of the Household of Ruth. Now, of course, in later years, we have the Hannah Jones, who's been mentioned doing so many things. Hannah Jones, you start looking at the Eighth Ward in history, Hannah Jones does everything. But Hannah Jones was also a member of this organization, as was Susan Sophia Smith, Charlotte Newman, and Josephine Bibb Davidson. Now, she's one of the outstanding members. If you read through the newspapers, Josephine Bibb, and she really took on the name Davidson when she married in 1894. she was a very eloquent speaker, and almost every presentation that was given that the chapter had, she would be the main speaker. I think I just sent out a clipping where they honored Jacob Compton on his 50th birthday, the household of Ruth, which was August the 3rd, I think 1886. And they present 50th birthday, and she was the presenter, and they gave him a special medal commemorating his relationship to the household of Ruth.
Ashley, may I have the next slide, please?
Yes.
Caleb, these are some of the ladies you were talking about.
Mentioned, yes. And of course, Amelia Chester is the daughter of Jane Chester, and she was very active in this organization. Charlotte Newman, who lived from 1830 to 1899. Susan Sophus. Sophus is a very popular name in Harrisburg. Her husband, in fact, the husbands of these men were well known and very active in either the Masonics, the Elks, or other lodges, along with USCT. So all these men were active in all the organizations at that time.
And Amelia Chester is Thomas Morris Chester's sister, correct?
Sister, that's correct.
Yes. Caleb, can I have the next slide, please? Caleb, tell us a little bit about the Henry Highland Garnett League and the women of the Henry Highland Garnett.
It's interesting to see how Henry Highland Garnett, reading Harrisburg history, he first appears here in the August parade of 1859. Now, a lot of people didn't realize this. Starting in August about 1850, every year, the African Americans of Harrisburg and of Pennsylvania in particular celebrated the anniversary of the revolution in Haiti. Every year they said that. So in Harrisburg that year, 1859, the Henry Highland Garnett League was first formed, or the Guards as they called them. I think in Pittsburgh, they had the Hannibal Guards, and in Philadelphia, the Johnson Guards, who were named for the Johnson had been the band leader in the 1820s and 1830s. So these organizations, these leagues were marching, and they actually paraded in uniform as early as 1859. But what we're recognizing Henry Highland Garnett League now is for in the 1863-64, the women organized here primarily Jane Chester and Annie Amos. Annie Amos was one of the vice presidents of the league. But some of our other men were also involved in the league, like O.L.C. Hughes and Thomas Morris Chester and some others. But the Garnett League is, given the fact that they were probably the first one to propose to have a grand review of USCT in Harrisburg after the Civil War, which they probably helped initiate, and it did happen, I think, November the 14th, 1865. And that's when, and we have done reenacting, we reenacted that event several times. And also the Garnett League was involved in sending food, sending money. In fact, Annie Amos even went to the South to teach some of the freedmen. In fact, schools were organized in the South under the Garnett League of Harrisburg. So it was a great organization. I don't have the names of all the women. So one of the things that we have now, we can get into some newspapers that are digitized. Unfortunately, at the State Library, we have some papers that we used to be able to pull that are not digitized. So I don't have the complete names of these women other than Annie Amos and Jane Chester. But there were I had at least 12 to 15 names at one time of the women that were involved with this.
So Jane Chester, of course, is the mother of Thomas Morris Chester, who we are honoring, whose statue is at the monument, the
Yes.
first full-life bronze figure of Chester. And we can see Annie Amos, who was mentioned by Dr. Jean Corey, organized. We can see these 34 women. There were 1,100 residents of the Old 8th Ward. We've chosen 100 of them, of which 34 are women, to honor as exemplars. But one great story, which Caleb and I love to share, is that the women of the Henry Highland Garnett League raised money for the regimental flags of the regiments of the United States Colored Troops. And here we are showing one of those regimental flags. Thank you, Caleb. Can I have the next slide, please? So on the monument is the name of Maude Coleman. And we became absolutely fascinated with Maude Coleman. And we found that here in Harrisburg, the dynamic Miss Yvonne Hollins, who we know for the founder of so many organizations, including her long history as director of the Boys and Girls Club, is a direct descendant of Maude Coleman. I've asked Dr. Leroy Hopkins, Miss Sally Chukwimanya, and Mr. Brian Williams if they would have conversation with Yvonne Hollins. Good evening, Yvonne Hollins. How are you? And Yvonne, do you have your mic muted? I think Yvonne? Dr. Leroy Hopkins, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, great, great. Miss Yvonne Hollins, welcome. So tell us your relationship to Maude Coleman.
I am a descendant of Maude Coleman. Maude Coleman is, I guess I'm actually her great niece.
And your mother?
And my mother is her niece, and my mother's 93 years old, alive and well, and I did receive some memories of Maude from her. Maude was born in 1883, and she passed in 1953, and I was 3 years old at that time. So I didn't know her that well. So the information that I have, most of it is coming from my mother and also Gail Jackson Quarles, who is in Los Angeles. She may be on this Zoom today. And if she is, then she will be sharing information with you.
Now, you have quite a large family. Maude has quite a number of descendants, both in central Pennsylvania and across the country. Could you tell us about that?
We have identified at least 165 living descendants of Maude Coleman. The majority of them are here in the greater Harrisburg area, some in Maryland, some in California, and also Canada. And
the family has a reunion every year, correct?
We normally have a reunion every year, and at that time, that's when all of us do get together, and it's just a beautiful time when we are able to share and find out about each other. And it was just amazing that I was accepted to be a part of the Monument Project. And at that time, it actually opened the doors to a great deal of information that I did not know, and many of our family members did not know about Maude. So this information, because we all know that the best history is the history that is shared verbally. And often it's lost, and that's why it's very important for us to make sure that we document and note this information, and that we continue to pass it on to all of our future generations.
And when I want information passed on, I turn to Dr. Leroy Hopkins. Dr. Leroy Hopkins, I know you're there. Welcome, sir. We're waiting for technology. Could you talk about Maude Coleman's impact on the voting rights and civil rights, and her exemplary work for the advancement of African American women?
Well, it's very interesting. I came across her name probably last year. My main source of information is newspapers.com. And just yesterday, I came across an article, the Reading newspaper, where Maude Coleman, I believe it was 1921, was at a meeting of the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and she's listed as the secretary. The national president was there, Hallie Q. Brown, and of course, my interest is focused mainly on Lancaster County. I'm from Lancaster. And Maude Coleman came to Lancaster a number of times, from the 1920s up to just before her death. In 1926, the recreation situation in Lancaster was such, Black children had no place to go to play, no place where there was organized recreation. And so the Hallie Q. Brown Club, which grew out of my church, Bethel AME Church in Lancaster, the Hallie Q. Brown Club started a recreation club. It was just called the Colored Recreation Club. But in that club, there was an organization, the Maude B. Coleman Club, and she came and talked to them. It was for young women who were to be trained in literacy, were to be given an opportunity to develop themselves. She was also, Maude Coleman came to Lancaster as a part of her work with the Department of Welfare in 1925 and organized a poverty survey. Out of this survey, which visited every community that had at least 100 persons of color, in Lancaster, as in other localities, an interracial council was created. It was chaired by the mayor of Lancaster, and Mrs. Coleman was involved. She came and talked to them at various occasions, and what their agenda was to get African Americans politically activated. She herself was a Republican, and she came several times to speak, to organize local Black women to become active in the Republican Party. But in something that echoed something that happened in my church in 1870, after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, there was a meeting chaired by Robert Boston, who was the pastor, and before that had been involved in the Underground Railroad. He also encouraged people of color to vote for the Republican Party, but only so long as they supported policies that were beneficial to people of color. And Maude Coleman said the same thing 50 years later. And she came back, for example, October 11th, 1942, the Crispus Attucks Community Center was dedicated. She was one of the speakers. And of course, her involvement with recreation began in the 1920s. And so 1942, she was back again to speak. And so she was, someone that should have been celebrated in Lancaster County a long time ago. And I'm glad that the Monuments Project gave us that opportunity to recognize her today.
You know, Dr. Hopkins and Yvonne Hollins, well, one of the amazing things we discovered about Maude Coleman is that at the end of let me slow down because I get excited. At the end of World War I, African American soldiers had amalgamated with German women and left mixed race orphans behind in Germany. And Maude organized adoption
Oh,
agency to
I
bring
didn't know that. That's
those
interesting.
mixed race children
Oh,
to America and to find homes through the families of the original father.
well,
Quite
Lenwood, that's interesting because I'm a retired professor of German, and my special interest is Afro-Germans. And that group of, they called them occupation babies. They were, the Germans pejoratively referred to them as the Rheinland Bastarde. And there was 400 of them, and most were sterilized forcibly in 1938 by the Nazis. But it's interesting that Maude Coleman was involved in this, because I know Jet Magazine was involved after World War II, because during the occupation, American forces occupied what is now Bavaria, and there were, well, no one knows how many Germans of African or African-American descent there are. Some estimates are 500,000. But it's interesting that you have this continuation of the involvement of a African-American woman with the interests of African children or children of African descent.
yes, children who were left behind. Could I have the next slide, please, Ashley?
She is.
There you'll see Maude Coleman, and she was involved in a number of incredible peace organizations.
NAACP, for example.
At the original founding of the NAACP, and a major organizer across throughout the 6 counties of central Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
We've put 2 teams together, Felix, of historians. One we refer to as the history detectives. They are in Harrisburg. And the other is we refer to as the Mod Squad in Lancaster County, to find the history of the Mod Squad. And it is like paleontology. I'd like to ask Brian Williams if he'll talk about this process that we've been searching for the history of Maude Coleman and our process of finding artifacts, objects.
Well, good afternoon. It's certainly our pleasure as history detectives from the Harrisburg area, that along with Caleb Jackson, who's also on here today. We started to identify many of the people, along with our partners at Messiah College, on the Poble Monument, the 100 Voices, as we call that. So our purpose here in Harrisburg was to begin the research. Ashley, if you would mind putting up that interview form again. There we go. This particular form is important for us as historical researchers because we would get this out to our descendants who have reached back to, whether it be Messiah or partners, or through Lenwood, or through our website, and it would capture specific information that we would need to actually validate and move forward, whether its date of birth and things such as that. We can share that for those that at a later time find that they would perhaps maybe a descendant of the old 8th Ward, and we can send that out to you after this meeting. You can take that down now, thank you. So what we found with Maude Coleman was we were identifying some of the descendants here in Harrisburg, and Yvonne had reached out to us. We knew that there was a very large connection there between 1923 and 1950 of Maude Coleman in the Lancaster and Reading areas, specifically Lancaster. So we became partners with Millersville University's Dr. Leroy Hopkins and some of the people down at the Lancaster YMCA to coordinate a historical research on Maude Coleman there in Lancaster. So that's where the Maude squads actually became, in that being the Lancaster Maude squad and then the Harrisburg Maude squad with the historical researchers that we have here as the history detectives.
May I have the
And
next
while we
slide,
were,
please? May I have the
Sorry?
next slide, please? Yes.
you'll see in here, we had reached out and started to identify some of the specific history of Maude, whether that was relayed by Yvonne Hollins or some of her very large descendant group there after she had completed the interview form. So we started the Maude squads in Lancaster and Harrisburg, beginning to meet in Millersville University.
May we have the next slide, please? Brian, your voice has gone out.
She had not only in Harrisburg and Reading and Lancaster, but across the state. So then we were then capturing this information and then getting that to our partners at Millersville University or college, and they then would retain that information for the purpose of retention at the state archives in Pennsylvania, like all the other 100 voices that we had on there and the statues for that. So here you'll see a picture of the meeting with Dr. Hopkins and our group down in the Millersville Library. And we were going through information there that perhaps not had been viewed by many for over 50 some years. And we were still cataloging information based on what we found through down there. We still have much more work to do in Lancaster. So Yvonne's family has helped us out greatly. One of her descendants and one of her relatives, Maude, actually had a Bible in California, a family Bible, to which one of our partners, Barbara Barksdale of Steelton, worked with her to get some of the photos professionally photographed and retained in their historical file that they have with Messiah that will eventually go to the state archives here in Harrisburg, and then the creation of the Maude Coleman memory box, which we can talk about, and Lenwood can probably touch on that a little bit more. So that's where the
may I have the next slide, please?
Right.
We have planted a 100-year oak tree in Maude's honor on the Riverfront Park in what we refer to as the Exemplars Grove. It is a grove of 12 trees we refer to as the 12 Disciples of Peace of Harrisburg, who some young change agents, some people who have transcended, and Maude Coleman's tree is planted between the World War I monument and the Holocaust monument, in keeping with the period of her life, and it is a 100-year oak tree. And her, next slide, please. Her memory box will be placed in the state archives. Yvonne, could you talk about some of these artifacts that the family is holding of Maude Coleman?
Well, the majority of them, Linwood and others, I'm unable to speak about. I'm not sure if Gail is on at all, but all of these are in Gail's possession out in Los Angeles. And she would often attend different functions with Aunt Maude. Whether it be the gala with the Y, or there were different functions that they would have with daughter and mother and daughter type situations. And Maude did lose her daughter during infancy. So Gail has all of this information. I believe that the one to the far right is a somewhat of a Bible or a diary. And it's the original, and everything that is there is just so authentic and very sensitive. So Gail is very, very protective of all of these items as well. So from my understanding at the archives is that they are going to actually take photographs, because it cannot be three-dimensional, to be placed into the memory boxes. There's going to be 4 boxes. Box 1, which is early life and her heritage, and box 2, the family life and social and community engagement. Box 3 is political and civic organization, which is actually mapping her range of influence. And box 4 will be letters and diaries and legacy documents.
And
so we're
we are
really excited. We are truly, truly excited about this, that all of this is going to go into the archives. And because it is a memory box, we will be able to add to it and also go in, and generations, our future generations will be able to go and actually see the photographs of what we have thus far in her memory box.
what we're excited about is what we call the combination of history detectives, which will find two-dimensional objects and flat objects to place in, and our own version of the Antique Roadshow, where we will help the family look at these wonderful objects like the cameo piece in the middle, where we'll help the family identify the objects, the manufacturer of the objects, and also assist them in how to handle and preserve and protect these many really wonderful objects of Maude Coleman. Sally, are you with us?
Yeah, I am.
Yes. So Maude impacted the African American origins of African American YWCAs and women's organizations. And you saw Miss Stacy Blake, executive director of the Lancaster YWCA, who is part of our Maude squad. The YWCA has placed their artifacts at Millersville University. And I asked Sally if she would join us and talk about how the YMCAs in Harrisburg, Reading, and Lancaster, where Maude impact, are carrying on that work. So Sally, could you talk about the civil rights and voting rights work that the YWCA is doing, that are kind of keeping Maude's fire going?
I'd be more than happy to. So hi, everybody. I'm actually one of the newest board members officially as of last month. So I'm really excited to be here with you all. And after talking to a couple board members, I was able to collect information as to how Maude Coleman and other pioneers, is how they call her as well, were able to influence the YWCA and keeping the advocacy for voting rights and civil rights. So last year, even during the pandemic, the YWCA in Lancaster collaborated with 25 local agencies with a nonpartisan effort to register new voters. And this is kind of like our nod to the work that Ms. Coleman provided to us years before. I believe around 1919, there was an article about her that she was, rain or shine, it didn't matter. She would be there at the polls making sure that people were able to vote. And it's just interesting that it was although she was doing that, it was just for me as a Latina, realizing that it wasn't until 1965, after the repression of Jim Crow laws, and when the President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the voting rights that allowed Latino women to be allowed to vote as well. So it's just interesting how to correlate how women were constantly fighting for other women to vote as well. The other thing that I learned about that Maude Coleman influence was that last year, the YWCA launched the Center for Racial and Gender Equity, which is a countywide work dedicated to listen, learn, and lead toward our mission of eliminating racism and empowering women. This program is every couple months, and it's free, but also donation. This helps from workforces to different programs that will help facilitate and teach people the ending and helping of eliminating racism and the empowerment of women.
So you at and Yvonne Hollins is quite connected to our YWCA in Harrisburg. We know that Maude worked in Harrisburg, in York, and Lancaster, and in Reading, carrying on that work. What, Sally, you've been listening to all this about these women on the monument and their work, you know, as a young, both pioneer and soldier on the battlefield for women's rights. What have you heard this evening that inspires you about Maude and that give you the spirit and power to carry her work forward in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I after reading stuff about her, it was really interesting to see, according to the Pittsburgh Courier, she was the first African-American tax collector in the country, and adding the future to the past, right? This year, as we all know, we have the first African Asian American woman as our vice president in the country. So it's beautiful to see how now a woman that's African American has the highest ranking female, she's the highest ranking female official in US history. So as a Latina woman and being inspired by African American women constantly, it makes me feel like these women's voices have been heard, and the legacy of women are being carried by multiple women on multiple positions. I think that's what has helped me, is learning that all these women, even back in the day with all those restrictions and boundaries, have found a way to live limitless. And she wasn't just a woman, but she placed herself in positions of power. And that's very, very empowering to know and be a part of.
It's so important, you know, Sally, because history writes them down as housekeepers or maids or cooks. These are powerful, extraordinary women that are on that monument, and their stories, which have been left out of history. Our history detectives, Sally, have to hunt because they're listed most of the time as the wife of so-and-so, and that's it, you know. They're listed on the census papers and objectified. But when we dig for their stories, we find their stories are blueprints for our passage. And so we are really hoping that you, as a young warrior and as a rising woman in the YWCA movement, will find Maude's story and the story of these 34 women and many other women to carry forward and kind of be North Star for you. We applaud you for your work, particularly your work in voting rights. And thank you for being with us this evening. The YWCA movements are joining the descendants of the Maude Coleman family to create, may I have the next slide, please? To create the stewardship fund for the monument. And that's a huge deal because it took us 3.5 years, Sally, to get permission to place this on the Capitol grounds, build the construct, which we call the Irvis Equality Circle, and place the monument there. But we weren't sure how we would continue to preserve and protect it. And Yvonne, would you talk about how you organize your family?
Yes, when Linwood shared the information with me, I just said, well, we can make this happen. So I contacted every family. I contacted a member of each family of all of the descendants, and each made a donation so that we were able to provide the first $2,500 to start the stewardship fund. And we're asking all of the other 100 all of the descendants of the 100 names on the pedestal, if they would also do the same. So our effort is to make sure that we maintain and preserve this beautiful, beautiful monument that has been placed here. And it's been successful thus far. And I'm sure that there are other families that I have been in contact with, such as the Elby family, and they are looking also to be a part of the Maude Coleman Stewardess Fund, excuse me. And we as a family, we as a community, we all work together. We're always supportive of each other. And all of the descendants of Maude Coleman are aspiring every day to emulate her in their family life and their work ethics. The descendants of Maude Coleman actually boast accomplishments such as we have doctors, physicians, surgeons, lawyers, psychologists, educators, administrators. And I also do want to say at this point, before I became the executive director of Boys and Girls Club, I was also an educator as a teacher, assistant principal, and the assistant superintendent of the largest school district in central Pennsylvania. So we have technologists and essential workers, politicians, yes, even politicians, clergy, professors, and hardcore working people. And effective on tomorrow will be the opening of a family-owned restaurant at 306 Riley Street, which is very close to the 8th Ward. Here we go. And it's called Isabel's Restaurant. So we continue to move forward. I'm sure that Maude would be extremely, extremely proud of all of us. And we are actually we're building the bridge for the rest of our generations, our future generations to cross.
And Sally, we are so excited that Stacy Blake and the YWCA of Lancaster has agreed to be the holding company for the stewardship fund for the monument. And Yvonne has leveraged that through the families, that fund that started with $2,500 is now $10,000 in that fund to keep this monument as pristine. Here you can see the artists and artisans from the Lancaster Foundry continuing to keep the monument at its pristine. If you go on the Capitol grounds, you will see that all of the monuments, the bronze monuments, are green. It's because they have oxidized, and the state does not have the funds to clean them and prepare them for bronze. So Yvonne's fund and the contributions of other families allow us every 90 days to clean and re-wax the monument so that we can keep it at this brilliant and beautiful and pristine. And now
Linwood, if I can, I'd also like to share that every Sunday as I go to my church to drop off my offering, I stop by the monument. I have a broom and I have a broom in my car to make sure that it's always clean. And I have a niece that goes every Saturday to make sure that she has a leaf blower and she makes sure that that area is kept clean. We want to make sure that whenever, at any given time that someone walks by or drives by, that they see the beauty in what has been placed here.
And we will ask anyone, yes.
Can I, this is Jean, can I just say one thing before you, I know we're late, but
and I believe that Frances Harper is with us.
I know, can I because my computer died, but Sally and Yvonne, one thing I did not get to say, but I want to say to you, Sally, I love what you said about Maude Coleman and the women and understanding her power. And I'm going to charge you, because you are very young, that I think what these women understood that Yvonne just articulated just now, and Yvonne has done all her life, she understands power that is coercive and oppressive, and she understands how to work in the systems, but she also understands the power of creativity and connections and interconnectedness. And that's what these women understood. So I really, Yvonne, I just love your life and love what you've done. But Sally, carry that forward, okay? Those two kinds of power that you have to work with.
Amen to that. Do we have Frances Harper with us?
Yes.
So we're going to end with Miss Frances Harper.
Good day.
Sally said that we should listen. So can we end this session by listening to Miss Frances Harper?
Well, I am honored to be here. And what an honor to have my memory held sacred, but even more of a blessing to know that there are women like Sally, like Yvonne, like all of you who continued my work through words, through actions, through activism in Harrisburg. And the attempt to stop us, to silence our voices, to make us accept invisibility and diminished value, you all are key in breaking those chains of oppression. I am most thankful for the women of color who came before me, and for those who stood with me, and for you who will come after me. I think of Gwendolyn Bennett, a famed writer and actor, and it was during your Harlem Renaissance, but she lived in Harrisburg. Imagine that. Harrisburg. Can any good thing come from Harrisburg, from the 8th Ward that was demolished, rolled over, forgotten, just like me? My dear sister Gwendolyn, she would come to be world-renowned as a writer and artist and part of your Harlem Renaissance. And women coming after me like Jessie Matthews Vaughn, who, like me, she was orphaned and abandoned. I was so young, 3 to be exact. My father was gone before I was born, but my uncle took me in and he made sure I got a good education, like Jessie. So both of us in spite of our abandonment and our orphaned situations, we went on to become scholars. Jesse graduated with honor from your Harrisburg High School. Went on to become the leadership for the paper, the Negro, the premier Negro publication of her time, the Pittsburgh Courier. And then Alice Dunbar Nelson, poets, they're dear to my heart. A speaker like me, an orator, an activist who continued the work in the charge and mobilized women. She devoted her life to mobilizing the women in Pennsylvania so that they would rise up and be given the vote. I've heard you talk today of the Wesley Union Church, and we could not have done it without the church, without the Lord. And this Alice, woman of strength, endured and appealed to the men, Black men, to join the efforts of the women's fight. So we can't do it alone. It takes all of us. And Miss Dunbar Nelson, her husband Nelson is what brought her to this area. Men standing so that we would be able to show the oppressor that we are a factor to be reckoned with and that we should not be despised. Reminds me of my time at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York City. It was 1866, May, I recall. And I was seated on the platform with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And I must admit, I was prepared to shake things up, and I did. Stepping to the podium, all eyes are upon this colored woman. What would she say? I began softly. I feel I am something of a novice upon this platform, born of a race whose inheritance has been outrage and wrong. Most of my life has been spent battling against those wrongs. We are all bound up in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any class of its members. At the South, the legislation of the country was in behalf of the rich slaveholders, while the poor white man was neglected. And what is this consequence today? From that very class of neglected, poor white men comes the man who stands today with his hand upon the helm of the nation. This grand and glorious revolution, which has commenced, will fail to reach its climax of success until throughout the length and breadth of the American Republic, the nation shall be so colorblind as to know no man by the color of his skin nor the curl of his hair. It will then have no privileged class trampling upon and outraging the unprivileged classes, but will be then one great privileged nation whose privilege will be to produce the loftiest manhood and womanhood that humanity can attain. I do not believe giving the white woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. And I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exalt from the skies. You white women here speak of rights. I speak of wrongs. In advocating the cause of the colored man since the Dred Scott decision, I have sometimes said that I thought that the nation had touched bottom. But let me tell you, there is a depth of infamy lower than that. It is when the nation, standing upon the threshold of a great peril, reached out its hands to a feebler race and asked that race to help it. And when the peril was over, said, "You are good enough for soldiers, but not good enough for citizens." You could hear a pin drop in that room. They did not want me to speak on their podiums any longer. 30 years passed, but I was still active in the struggle. And at the age of 67, my novel, Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, was published. There was such a flurry around my book being one of the first published novels written by a Black woman. A few years later, in my 70s, all of my advocacy work led me to be a co-founder with Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, and so many other strong women. We co-founded the National Colored Women in July of 1896. And this started the Black Women's Club movement. Our motto was lifting as we climb. Your historians crowned me the mother of African American literature. You can't silence a queen any more than you could silence the king. I am Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Say my name. I refuse to be silenced, but only you can give me voice. On February the 20th, 1911, in Philadelphia, my earthly temple gave out, and they placed the shell of my body in the same grave as my precious Mary, who I had outlived by 2 years. I did see my dream come true. The words I captured in my poem, "Bury me in a free land." I ask no monument, high or proud, to arrest the gaze of passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves. The Civil War abolished slavery, but civil rights will make us equal. And that is the ultimate freedom. Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Are we? March on, soldiers. There's still work to do.
Thank you, Ms. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. There is still work to do. So we end as we began with asking our guests, the grand-worthy matron and the grand-worthy patron, who are continuing this work, whose legions of Masons and Eastern Stars are marching to Zion. Beautiful, beautiful Zion. Marching upward to Zion, that beautiful city above. We ask them to give us words of benediction that encourage us to continue the struggle for equality, the struggle for the franchise, and the fulfillment of the American dream. Madam and sir, would you give us your last words in the form of benediction for this?
Sir, I'm very pleased to been on your program tonight. And I know that in our organization, we truly learn how to love one another. So, and I always say to our members that, as we all know, that prayer works. And that was a very good orientation of what she had to say, and something that was said, that she said, free at last, free at last. But I want to tell you that we as an organization certainly are on the same page as the dissertation she just gave. Granary Matron, do you have any remarks?
I just want to thank you for the opportunity that we have had to be here with you all today. And as we leave this place, we ask that God would not leave our space. But we also ask that everyone would just continue to love one another, that we stay safe, and that we stay in prayer for one another in these unparalleled times. Again, it was my honor and my pleasure to be here. We hope to see you again soon in person. Take care.
God bless you all. Thank you so much for coming. We'll see you at the Crossroads. We'll see you at the Crossroads. Meet us at the monument when you can.
Yes.
Make a monument of your own life and a crossroads of your own courage. And above all, don't forget to vote.
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming out this evening. And we end. Look for us on April 15th when we do our session called Finding Thomas Chester, where we dig into history to look at the 5 communities that Thomas Chester impacted: Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, New York, Atlanta, and New Orleans. And we reconstruct his journey for freedom through articles, artifacts, and famous speeches. Thank you all so much. Thanks to the Dauphin County Library System, and very, very special thanks to the Foundation for Enhancing Communities, our fiscal agent. Frances Harper, God bless you, and God bless you all, and have a safe evening. We'll
Peace and blessings. Safe journey.
Safe journeys to all. Thank you very much, and good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.